When done well, the alternate history genre takes events that have a weight of inevitability about them, such as the Union victory in the American Civil War, and subjects them to the randomness and bumbling of life. Harry Turtledove's How Few Remain hinges on one such example, the fortuitous finding of General Lee's Special Order 191 by McClellan's army during the 1862 Maryland campaign. Or rather, not finding it in this case. That don't sound like it'd be something you'd want to lose. Not hardly. The lieutenant tried to imagine what would have happened to him if General Lee found out he'd lost the order. Appalling as that notion was, an even worse one replaced it, one so horrific he said it out loud as if to exorcise it. If McClellan's men picked up that envelope, they'd know exactly what we aim to do and they'd be able to break us right up. The turning point here is that General McClellan didn't have clear intel on what Lee planned, down to which roads would be taken by which units, and was therefore unable to effectively counter the Confederate Army's invasion of Maryland. And so, in this tale at least, the entire course of the war is altered. Bringing us to Kansas, 1881, with Colonel George Custer chasing some Kiowa. They ride across the border, but it's Custer, so he's going to chase them. Until he spots some Confederate cavalry watching, just waiting for him to cross the line. "Good morning to you, Colonel," the captain drawled, nodding in a way that looked friendly enough. "You weren't planning on riding over the international border by any chance, were you?" "If I was, you'll never prove it, Captain." Custer tried for cool detachment. What came out was a frustrated snarl. Relations between the two countries are not good. There is some trade and they exchange diplomats, but it's quite frosty. The war ended almost 20 years before, but it's less peace than a freezing of hostilities and ossifying of grievances. It won't take much to put the two back at each other's throats. And two factors come together to make it happen. First, James G. Blaine has been elected president, the first Republican since Lincoln was run out of Washington in disgrace. Here he's portrayed as an inept blowhard, which is not entirely fair. The key, though, is that he was elected less on his own merits than because the people were terminally sick of the Democrats, which sounds a little familiar. And while the Democrats were excessively deferential toward the Confederacy, the Republicans have degenerated to just an anti-Confederate party. Make America tough again, you might say. But will James G. Blaine, having been elected on a platform that consisted largely of snorting and pawing the ground, now have to show the world it was nothing but humbug and hokum? Even if it was humbug and hokum, will he dare admit it, knowing that if he should confess to weakness, even weakness genuinely and manifestly in existence, he will become a laughingstock and an object of contempt not only in foreign capitals, but in the eyes of the exasperated millions who sent him to the White House to make America strong and proud again, and will with equal avidity send him home with a tin can tied to his tail if he bollockses the job? That's attributed to Samuel Clemens, in this timeline working as a newspaper editor in San Francisco. The second factor that comes into play is that Mexico needs money, needs it enough to sell some of its territory. The Confederacy buys Sonora and Chihuahua for $3 million, thereby extending their territory to the West Coast and greatly lengthening the border with the USA. It's only a matter of time before war breaks out, and both sides have to fight it within limitations. For the U.S., it's simply a lack of military preparedness. The previous 20 years have been a time of appeasement rather than war planning. The U.S. military just isn't up to the task of fighting a sustained conflict over such a wide territory. The Confederacy isn't either, but they have the advantage of alliances with Britain and France. With French influence in Mexico and British forces in Canada, the United States will find itself in a vice grip if those allies enter the war. And they will, for a price. James Longstreet, now president of the CSA, has concluded that the price is necessary. France and Britain demand manumission of the slaves in exchange for their active support. Unsurprisingly, this causes a rift. There are very few who like the idea, and some are completely unwilling to go along with it. There's even a coup plot. After winning their independence in a war fought in large part over their slave-based economy and everything connected to it, many Confederates find it unacceptable to dismantle it to placate moralizing foreigners. Meanwhile, in the United States, the concentration of wealth into the hands of a tiny few has become acute, and the working class is straining. Abe Lincoln is still traveling the country, speaking of the need for reforms. He's broadened his anti-slavery stance to include the wage slavery of the American worker. He has a brief discussion with a young Teddy Roosevelt about his pinko leanings. "You, sir, are a Marxian socialist." A Marxian socialist, Colonel Roosevelt, believes the revolution will come no matter what measures be taken to prevent it. My view is the revolution will come unless strong measures be taken to prevent it. Ah, Roosevelt gave a slow, thoughtful nod. That is a distinction. Unlike Custer, he evidently could feel the intellectual force of a counterargument. That index finger stabbed out again. But you do believe the pernicious Marxian doctrine of the class struggle? I do believe it, yes, Lincoln said. I do not believe it pernicious, not after spending my time since the War of Secession observing what has been afoot in the United States, in the Confederate States, and as best as I can at a distance, in Britain and Europe as well. Class struggle is balderdash, poppycock, Roosevelt declared. We can attain a harmonious society by adjusting our laws and their interpretation so as to secure to all members of the community social and industrial justice. We can, surely, I said as much, Lincoln replied. But shall we? Or will those in whose hands most capital now rests seek only to gain more? That looks to be the way the wind is blowing, and it blows a fire ahead of it. And when Lincoln partners with the socialists, it creates the beginning of something that America has always lacked, a real labor party with a revolutionary streak. Across North America, we have two nations at war, each founded on ideas that are at least partly at odds with the reality of the day. Both are facing an internal struggle for the soul of their nations. The war distracted everyone and let those problems fester instead of being dealt with in the open. It's relevant now. A few years ago, the phrase national divorce would come up from time to time, much less so now. It's that same idea, trying to solve a fundamental divide by separating. Only it doesn't work because it doesn't solve the underlying issues. It just lets each side pretend that it's all the other guy's fault. Probably why it's fallen out of use. There's a growing realization that someone actually has to win. The game is for all the marbles. If you can peacefully coexist, you don't need to separate. If you can't, the only peace is victory. Turtledove is at his best when he's writing stories close to whatever point of departure creates his alternative world, using real historical figures as characters, extrapolating from things they said into the new setting. This book is full of that, whether it's Samuel Clemens writing editorials, Abraham Lincoln as a champion of the working man, Teddy Roosevelt fighting the British in Montana instead of the Spanish in Cuba, James Longstreet turned from general to shrewd politician, even a battle pitting the British General Charles Gordon, best known for his campaigns in China and the Sudan, against George Custer. We'll talk about Gordon a little bit more in a different video. What's notable here is that it's a battle between two generals with a tendency to plow straight into the enemy and try to break through with overwhelming force, which served them well fighting Sudanese or Indians, but modern armies of the day were better equipped to deal with such attacks. The battle illustrates that shift from a romantic idea of war, heroic cavalry charges and all that, to a cold science. The British Army depicted here has a long and proud martial tradition, which in part makes it slow to change. Lancers, Roosevelt thought derisively. We're nearing the end of the 19th century and the British still have Lancers in the line. I'm not going to dive into the whole rabbit hole about the pros and cons of having Lancers in a world where firearms exist. It's not quite as ridiculous as it seems depending on the circumstances. The point in this book is to contrast it with the Union force. Whether Roosevelt's volunteer mounted troops with Winchester rifles or Custer's regulars with their Gatling guns, the brave Lancers fare rather poorly. That isn't to say that this is a simple innovative New World versus conservative Old World face-off. Custer doesn't want those Gatlings. He doesn't trust the newfangled gadgets. But a subordinate, not having been specifically ordered to pull them back, keeps them on the line. That decision gives the U.S. Army the victory that day. Custer, of course, laps up all the credit, which tracks. There's an inertia on the U.S. side, whether a resistance to adopt new technologies and new ways of fighting, or the continuing reluctance to form alliances. The Confederate States, having broken away politically, are also shown to have broken away from some of the traditionalism in practical terms. They try much harder to be part of an international community, forming trade partnerships and military alliances. But also in smaller details. For example, while the U.S. continues to use impractical blue wool uniforms in the field, the Confederacy is in the process of phasing out their gray for British-inspired khaki, though they refer to it as butternut, which could send us on a deep rabbit hole discussion of Confederate uniform variations due to all sorts of issues. The relevant takeaway here being that the Confederate Army in the story is not as conservative and tradition-bound as its northern counterpart. This isn't to say that the Confederacy is forward-looking or progressive, just younger and less set in its ways in some respects. Not slavery, of course. That's still deeply rooted in the economy and the culture of this 1880s Confederacy. We have to talk about Frederick Douglass. For him, the Civil War, or the War of Secession in this case, was absolutely a fight to end slavery. And slavery won. Douglass lives comfortably in New York, writing prolifically, but his mission in life has largely failed. Millions are still in bondage in the South, and the North is no longer a beacon of hope for them. Before the Southern states left the Union to form their own nation, he had been a spokesman for 1 man in 8 in the United States. Now 90% of the Negroes in the North American continent resided in a foreign country, and most of the white citizens of the USA were just as glad it was so. They might have been gladder yet had the figure been 100%. As often as not, they blamed the relative handful of blacks left in the United States for the breakup of the nation. Douglass is an idealist. Slavery is immoral and abhorrent, and therefore one must oppose it. Personally, I think he's right, and rightly he's deeply disappointed in his country for not acting on that. Before the war, the Fugitive Slave Act had been a stench in the nostrils of most Northerners. Now, though the law was no longer on the books, slavery having at last become extinct in the USA, fugitive slaves found less sympathy than they had a generation earlier. Did calling them foreigners make such a difference? Evidently. There's obvious applicability to current events here, and also an illustration of their complexity. Compassion and moral righteousness alone isn't policy. What would happen if the United States of this story encouraged slaves to run away and come north to freedom? The Confederate States would be forced to militarize the border, and the United States would have to counter. Can't have an army camped out on your border, especially one that has invaded your territory in recent memory. Most of the slaves making the journey will not make it, and what to do with those that do? They have very limited skills in most cases, illiterate, bringing no wealth or prospects. Merely providing food and housing breeds resentment all around, from those forced to pay for it to those receiving it from a paternalistic hand. How does one take in waves of such people and make them productive, self-reliant citizens? What is the societal cost? Douglass doesn't have an answer. There are no easy answers. Lincoln takes a different tack, illustrated in a conversation between them in Chicago as they try to agree on a plan to reform the Republican Party. The plight of the Negro is worse and more deserving of attention, Douglass insisted. The plight of the Negro in the United States is not far different from the plight of other proletarians in the United States, and grows less different day by day, Lincoln said. In looking toward the Negro in the Confederate States, for whom we can do little, you ignore both the Negro and the white man in the United States, for whom we can do a great deal. I look to amend the worst evil I see, Douglass said stiffly, which is also the one least susceptible to amendment. This fits well with Lincoln's position, his pragmatism during the war. Time for a little historical aside. In the summer of 1862, Horace Greeley, a prominent abolitionist and founder of the New York Tribune, published an open letter calling Lincoln out, expressing how he and others are sorely disappointed and deeply pained by the policy you seem to be pursuing with regard to the slaves of the rebels. He went on to enumerate several grievances, such as his lack of zeal in liberating the slaves. Activist journalism is nothing new. It's too long to read in full here, but Greeley's open letter to Lincoln is not hard to find should you be interested. Lincoln wrote a brief reply to the paper, which they published. The core of which, and the part that is usually quoted, reads, "If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union." That said, somebody always jumps in with, "You didn't read the rest!" The letter concludes, "I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." Lincoln was a pragmatist. He absolutely wanted to end slavery. The Republican Party was founded for that purpose. But he knew that preserving the Union was a necessary prerequisite for emancipation, and therefore his priority. Save the Union, and he can try to free the slaves another day. Let the Union fall, and there's fuck all any Northern abolitionists can do about slavery. So he prioritizes. His personal desire to end slavery has to play second fiddle to his job of keeping the country intact. First things first. That kind of political realism is increasingly rare lately, which I suspect is why some people read that last line and interpret it as a wink. But really, Horace, I'm just doing this to free the slaves, whatever it takes. All this Union talk is just to get those normie moderates on board. No. And his conversation with Frederick Douglass in the book is in the same vein. Work on the greatest good you can actually achieve, not necessarily the purest ideal. And despite his disagreement with Lincoln here, Douglass has become detached from the abolitionist cause in his own ways, though he doesn't quite see it. He travels the country frequently, often by riverboat. Whenever he traveled to a city on the northern bank of the Ohio, he went by steamboat. That way, standing by the port or starboard rail, depending on whether he was going downstream or up, he could look into Confederate Kentucky. He's still passionate about the injustice of slavery, but it's become somewhat abstract. A younger Frederick Douglass would likely be much less cavalier about floating down the Ohio River so he could look into slaveholder territory. But with war looming, such travels become dangerous. A shore battery on the Kentucky side orders the riverboat to stop for inspection, but they make a run for it and shelling commences. They're a local militia with outdated guns, and the damaged boat makes it to the Ohio side, but the prospect of being caught on the Confederate side gives Douglass a good scare. Not enough to keep him from returning during the war to cover the fighting in and around Louisville. Reading it, you can feel the hubris. You know he's going to get caught. Of course, General Jackson doesn't know what to do with him, so he telegraphs Richmond for instructions. After waiting over a cordial meal and conversation, President Longstreet sends word ordering Douglass return to the United States. The French really like Douglass, and he needs to keep them happy. But during the meeting, neither Douglass nor Jackson match their assumptions about each other. Both expect to meet the Antichrist, but instead meet a man. And Douglass finds that having a moral philosophy and being a good man aren't necessarily the same thing, as he tells his wife about the encounter. What was it like? It was frightening. He held up a hand before his son or wife could speak. Not in the way you think, either. It was frightening because I found myself in the presence of a man both formidable and, I judge, good, but one who believes deep in his heart in things utterly antithetical to those in which I believe, and who reasons with unfailing logic from his false premises. He shivered. It was, in every sense of the word, alarming. How Few Remain is the first in a long series following these two Americas through time as they continually make war on each other, and, in the process, reflect some things about our own country that isn't always flattering. But this book on its own portrays a war fought almost out of spite, and it takes a more charitable view of Longstreet's presidency than of Blaine's. I've certainly heard Turtledove be accused of romanticizing the Confederacy and promoting the lost cause narrative. I don't think that's what he's doing, but trying to have a calm and nuanced discussion about the American Civil War on the internet is a fool's errand, so I'll just say that he makes a good effort to humanize these historical figures. Not always flattering, but human. Notably, it breaks from his earlier book, Guns of the South, which depicted Robert E. Lee in particular in a very favorable light. Lee is dead by the time of this story, but Confederate generals like Longstreet and Jackson are depicted as patriots, if misguided, rather than simply heroes or villains. In any case, the war goes badly for the United States, opening with the evacuation of the government to Philadelphia when D.C. predictably falls under Confederate artillery bombardment, then blockades of coastal ports in the Great Lakes by British gunboats, incursions from Canada, and the failure of the U.S. offensive into Kentucky. Peace terms are offered, probably more generous terms than would really be the case. Essentially a return to the pre-war status quo, with the exception that the United States recognizes the Confederate purchase and annexation of Sonora and Chihuahua. President Blaine finds this to be humiliating and unacceptable, but he also doesn't have a military response. So he does nothing. Just waits and hopes it goes away. Fighting resumes, and Britain annexes half of Maine, the president's home state. Again, the same terms are offered, with recognition of the Maine territorial concession added on, of course, and again, Blaine just sits on it. It takes the intervention of the German consulate, specifically Alfred von Schlieffen, to convince him to agree to the terms. There's a nice little bit with him starting to formulate what becomes the Schlieffen Plan after studying Lee's, in this story, successful Maryland campaign. But in the end, little is accomplished by either side, and animosities are hardened. The stage is set for another war a generation later. Is any of it remotely plausible? Could Lee have drawn the Union Army away from D.C., engaging it in the open, wearing it down and putting political pressure on Lincoln to end the war had his orders not been found by a lucky Union corporal? Could it offset the differences in industrial capacity? Highly debatable. Few would dispute that Lee was the better general, but that alone doesn't win wars. The more interesting speculation, at least to me, is on the consequences of the United States splitting. In this case, the Monroe Doctrine is over, opening the Western Hemisphere back up to European powers. The United States has to take a very different posture, no longer insulated from invasion by vast oceans, instead sharing a long border with its bitterest enemy. There are cultural implications, too. Samuel Clemens is living in San Francisco because his family land in Tennessee is now in a foreign country. The American literary classics of Mark Twain don't exist. And of course, the political implications of the beginnings of industrial slavery and then manumission, though probably in name only in the South, and the rise of a major socialist party in the North sets American history on a very different course. And on the manumission question, is it at all plausible that the Confederacy, after fighting and winning a war caused at its root by their slave economy, would be willing or even capable of giving it up? Certainly not joyfully, but they would have faced heavy international pressures and pressing economic realities. And remember that the heady days of the United States winning independence in 1783 quickly led to significant changes as the reality of their circumstances sank in. The Confederacy in the 1870s and 80s would likely have faced similar dramatic changes from their wartime self-image. Turtledove writes his vision of it in the following books of the series, though a vision more about telling a good story than teasing out the most likely path of events. Personally, I suspect that the two nations would eventually become close allies. It would take a couple generations, but the shared heritage coupled with similar interests in the wider world would exert some mutual pull. Something like a CSA, USA, Canada version of NAFTA would start to look very appealing in the 20th century, though slavery would be a deal breaker, another pressure on the Confederacy to, at the very least, obfuscate it in legalistic games, free but without options. But that's a lot of the fun of these kinds of stories, teasing out some historical justifications for taking it in strange directions to see if anything enlightening shakes out along the way. Real history only looks inevitable in hindsight, and sometimes the road not taken can show us some things that we miss along the familiar path. This whole thing kind of reminds me that at the height of the whole tearing down Confederate monuments thing, I thought it would be kind of funny to make statues of fake Confederates and place them in out-of-the-way corners of public parks, then just wait for someone to make a big stink about how problematic and horrible this guy I made up was. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Jarvis, who in 1862 led a battalion to liberate prisoners held at Fort Mackinac. Goofy stuff like that. It's probably best for the world that I don't have the wealth to facilitate this kind of Loki-esque mischief on the body politic.